creative block is when you have no idea what to do. It's when you stop.
The most creative project I worked on recently, I think, was actually the film we did. And I found that creating the film, it took a lot of forethought, which I found, which was actually, it was rather difficult. It was more difficult than any of the projects I've done before. It takes a lot of forward planning. I think that, in essence, is very creative thinking.
I think there are two kinds that I can think of. One is, which is a bit like a rabbit in the headlights, where a kind of complete panic descends, perhaps because there's a deadline and you cannot think of an idea. And the other kind of creative block that comes to mind is you have a kind of sense of either an emotional quality of a building, a sensory quality of a project, but don't actually have the language in terms of architectural language to actually convey that.
An idea can be sparked from something that's a creative piece or something that develops into something creative, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm.
There's a speed in which you kind of realise that what you're doing is something not necessarily that satisfies that design and idea. And I guess what I'm relating that to is, say in practice, when you're working on like a computer program, you don't necessarily have that same flow, where when you're drawing, it's kind of a speed at which you can kind of start to address and correct those things in your mind.
The creative block is part of the creative process. It's usually the part that's full of stress and worry. I think the creative block is where you want something to go, but you can't actually get there yet because you haven't worked out what it is you're trying to do. Fundamentally, it's a problem of communication and taking the idea in your head and putting it in a format that's easier for other people to understand. Just a void of inspiration.
Might be triggered by something or someone else maybe making a comment, or maybe sometimes when it's working really well, working with people who are maybe coming from a different direction but have a very similar goal in terms of wanting to have a creative output.
I think it all depends on the flexibility of your mind, I think. Allow your mind to go crazy. There's no restrictions or no boundaries.
Well, I don't describe it as a leap before, but I would say that quite often if you are in that cycle where you're stuck in a loop that isn't achieving anything, or it's having a negative impact on your work, that a leap, for me, quite often happens when you do something completely different. So it could be when you're on the train, or walking home from work, or something completely different to what you're supposed to be doing. And that's where things can just pop into your head that make a difference and make that leap.
A creative leap is the design move you make to remedy a creative block, and it's not always necessarily a single move. It can be a series or a process, and usually you don't realise that you've actually made it until after you've made it. So for me, the creative usually is reading around the subject and getting loads of data and research, really understanding what it is that you want to add to your project.
There must be a reason for everything you have created. In a sense, it can be logical, it can be rational, but it also can be irrational. It could be a moment of genius, it could be a moment of madness.
Now that was the question that I wasn't entirely sure how to answer. I don't know if architectural creativity is any different than any other kind of creativity. I think any kind of creativity involves imagination and problem solving and thinking about things in a different way. And I think applying it to architecture is the same thing. It's having a problem or a brief or a client with an idea and you're trying to work through what you can do with it in the most creative and imaginative way.
I think it's the way in which you can develop an idea in a drawing. You can start to kind of gradually realise what those components might become, whereas in a computer program, using Revit as an example, you are forced to make a decision immediately about what a component must be, whereas it freezes it in a kind of state. And I think actually what architectural creativity is the ability to develop an idea through process iteratively, where it's kind of free from the constraints of pinning down exactly what that construction component might be, or that form might be, and it's kind of allowing it to form naturally almost.
Creative block is when you have a lack of purpose or a lack of ideas. You have difficulty seeing the bigger picture or the wider scheme of things. But it's also paired with an excess of busyness and organization.
I have to remove myself from the situation, and I find this, obviously I'm drawing purely on personal experience here, but physical movement I think helps this, because I focus on one thing. When you're really focused on moving physically, you don't focus so much on the particular details, but it seems to kind of keep running subconsciously. And then you leap when you're not expecting it.
Creative design process, an enjoyable one usually, where everything sort of ties up. So if you're working for a client, the client is enthusiastic and engaged, and you learn from the client. The people generally that you're working with have a kind of similar sort of empathy, I suppose, in terms of ways forward. It's an open dialogue where people are throwing in ideas. And I suppose one of the projects that I worked on, which I suppose examples of that was I was doing a community project with somebody, and we had very different skills. She was very good on sort of conceptual areas, I was good on kind of technical realisation. Outputs that were sort of more creative in terms of some of the inputs.
Architectural creativity is, for me, is use of space smartly. So how you get most of this space.
It's the thing that will help you get over that wall. I like to just go outside, flush my mind completely,
assume that you're supposed to start with very little architectural creativity and come out with some magical idea of what architectural creativity is. I think that's very simplistic and flattens the idea of design. I don't think there's specifically any particular school of creativity that's different to any others. But I guess if you were to just think of that down to its essence, it's the ability to transform a brief or a rational project into something that is both habitable and functional, with a cultural response and aesthetic pleasing.
For me to be at my most creative, I have to have other people around me. I have to be able to bounce ideas off people. I find that if I'm working things on my own, then that cycle of getting stuck into a problem and not being able to resolve it happens more often than when I'm working with other people. So I think getting other people's experiences and viewpoints on what you're doing is essential, really. Not necessarily within your own discipline, but also with others outside it as well. That's the process.
Creative leaps is action that taking out of this box and to think creatively outside the box.
This is a good question for me. I don't think there is a creative design process, and I don't think there's specifically one that fits every person. I think the process is completely individual and it's completely about who you are as a person and how you design. And it's certainly more complex than a diagram or a Venn diagram. And I guess it's about working out your limitations and your skills and using those the best you can to communicate your ideas.
I would say that a creative block is when you get to a point where no matter how many iterations of something you do, you can't get any further. It's something that I think happens to everyone, and it can be a sort of cycle of getting completely stuck and not getting anywhere and feeling a lack of any kind of effectiveness in your project, I suppose.
For me, quite often is something that comes out looking relatively simple in terms of a kind of key idea, but that achieves a kind of feeling, a quality in terms of the actual ambitions of the emotional quality of the space, as well as the actual sort of functional sequencing. And so quite often it's about everything, the configuration of the space, the use of the materials, the consideration of the materials, the quality of light. It's not one single factor. It's about how people interact with it in terms of the space.
Well, I think then it's also again to do with the analysing, like the questioning game. This is when you have so many options and routes that I can't see where the path through the process is. I think that's where I personally have this block when I can't quite see the route, is because of there's a myriad of so many options